Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little journey into a time that was remarkably polite, incredibly stiff, and, as it turns out, slowly poisoning itself for the sake of aesthetics. I want you to just settle in, maybe adjust your pillow and dim the lights. We're going to talk about the Victorian era, a period we often think of as being all lace doilies and repressed emotions, which it was, but it was also a time when people were essentially living in a toxic cloud of their own making. Specifically, we're looking at the Victorian Arsenic Craze. Because, of course, if you're going to be a world-dominating empire, you might as well do it while glowing a faint, sickly green. So let's just ease into the emerald-tinted madness of the 19th century. No rush, just the gentle, rhythmic hum of a society that decided lethal was a small price to pay for fashionable. Part 1. The Green Room of Death. So, arsenic. Today we know it as the classic choice for a dramatic murder mystery or a very effective rat poison. But for the Victorians, it was basically the kale of the 1850s. It was everywhere. It was in the walls, it was in the dresses, it was in the candles, and occasionally it was even in the blancmange. And the reason for this was a man named Carl Wilhelm Scheele. Back in 1775, he invented a pigment called Scheele's green. It was a stunning, vibrant copper arsenite hue that made everything look like a lush tropical forest. It was also, as the name suggests, packed with enough arsenic to take out a small cavalry unit. But the Victorians didn't know that yet, or more accurately, they didn't really want to know. They were obsessed with this green. Before Scheele, green dyes were often dull or prone to fading into a depressing brownish gray. But Scheele's green, and its later even more toxic cousin, Paris green, stayed bright. It popped. It was the it color for the aspiring middle class who wanted their parlors to look like a botanical garden. Imagine walking into a Victorian drawing room. It's cozy, there's a fire going, which ironically made the situation worse, and the walls are covered in beautiful, intricate floral wallpaper. It looks lovely, but as the room warms up, the moisture in the air reacts with the arsenic in the wallpaper. A little mold starts to grow behind the paper because Victorian houses were notoriously damp, and that mold starts to eat the arsenic, releasing it as a colorless, odorless gas called trimethylarsine. So, you're sitting there, sipping your tea, discussing the latest Dickens installment, and you're literally breathing in a slow-motion execution. If you started feeling a bit vapid or had a persistent headache or your skin started breaking out in weird sores, you didn't call a toxicologist. You probably just assumed you had a weak constitution or that your humors were, as we discussed earlier, a bit out of whack. You might even go to the doctor, who would then prescribe you a tonic, which likely contained a little bit more arsenic to brighten your complexion, because why not double down on the very thing that's killing you? The irony here is almost too much to handle. The wealthier you were, the more green rooms you probably had. The elite were essentially paying premium prices to turn their homes into gas chambers. And it wasn't just the walls. Let's float over to the fashion world, which was quite literally to die for. If you were a fashionable Victorian lady, you wanted a dress in that specific glowing emerald green. To achieve that color, fabric was soaked in arsenic. A single ball gown could contain up to 900 grains of arsenic. For context, about 4 or 5 grains is enough to kill an adult. So you're walking around a ballroom looking like a forest nymph, carrying enough poison to wipe out the entire guest list. And it wasn't just the wearer who suffered. The sweated labor, the seamstresses, and the artificial flower makers were the real casualties. These women worked in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms, surrounded by clouds of green dust. They would go home with green fingernails, green hair, and eventually they would start vomiting green bile before their organs simply gave up. There are contemporary accounts of flower makers dying with the green in their eyes. It's a dark, tragic contrast to the polite society that wore the finished products. They wanted the beauty of the meadow without any of the actual, living nature. But the Victorians were nothing if not resilient in their denial. Even when doctors started pointing out that maybe, just maybe, the green wallpaper was making children drop dead, the manufacturers fought back. They called it alarmism. They argued that you'd literally have to eat the wallpaper to get sick, which, knowing Victorian children, probably happened more than they cared to admit. But the gas was the real silent killer. It took a long time for the craze to fade. It wasn't a sudden Dan, it was more of a slow, creeping realization. People started noticing that their pet canaries were falling off their perches in green rooms. They noticed that their guests would leave dinner parties with inexplicable bouts of illness. Eventually, the Queen of Green, Queen Victoria herself, had a visiting dignitary get sick in an emerald guest room at Buckingham Palace. She allegedly had the wallpaper ripped out the next day, and when the Queen says the wallpaper is ghastly, the rest of the country usually follows suit. But the arsenic wasn't finished with them yet, because of course the Victorians didn't just want to live in arsenic, they wanted to eat it and wear it on their faces. It was the ultimate glow-up ingredient. Let's move our attention to the Styrian arsenic eaters. This was a group of people in the Austrian Alps who were famous for eating large quantities of arsenic. They claimed it gave them a healthy glow, improved their breathing at high altitudes, and made them generally more robust. When word of this reached England, the Victorian public, always looking for a shortcut to beauty, decided this was a fantastic idea. You could buy Dr. Rosie's arsenic complexion wafers. They were marketed specifically to women who wanted that pale, translucent, consumptive look that was so popular. The idea was that the arsenic would kill off some of your red blood cells, giving you a fashionable, ghostly pallor. And it worked. It also gave you kidney failure and neurological damage, but hey, you looked great in a candlelit parlor. There's a certain dry irony in the fact that the wealthier you were, the more healthy and vital you tried to look by Victorian standards, the more you were actually rotting from the inside out. It was a culture obsessed with appearances, to the point where the appearance of health was more important than the actual state of being alive. Even the children weren't safe. There were green toys, green candles for birthday cakes, and even green wrappers on sweets. It was a total saturation of the environment. And yet, the Victorian era is remembered for its morality and its strict adherence to rules. It turns out the one rule they couldn't follow was the one about not poisoning your own family for the sake of a nice shade of paint. As we drift further into the night, just think about those quiet Victorian nurseries with their beautiful green walls and their little lead soldiers and the soft, slow ticking of a clock. It was a world of hidden dangers masked by extreme politeness, a world where the very things meant to bring comfort and status were the things that brought the end. But don't worry, our walls are probably not made of arsenic anymore. We've moved on to other, more modern ways of being accidentally self-destructive. But the Victorians, they really did it with style. They turned a chemical weapon into a lifestyle choice. Let's just rest with that thought for a moment. The emerald glow, the pale faces, and the slow, silent accumulation of the green. It's all very peaceful now. The poison has long since settled into the soil and the wallpaper has been stripped away. So we've escaped the emerald-tinted gas chambers of the drawing room, but the Victorian quest for a refined look didn't stop at the wallpaper. If you were a lady of standing, or even just someone who spent too much time reading the back of questionable lifestyle magazines, you knew that looking healthy was, frankly, a bit common. The goal was to look like a piece of fine bone china, translucent, fragile, and perhaps a bit haunted. And the easiest way to achieve that porcelain finish? Lead. Lots and lots of lead. Now, using lead in makeup wasn't exactly a new invention. The Romans did it, and we know how that ended for them. But the Victorians, in their infinite wisdom, decided that their superior modern chemistry could surely handle a little heavy metal poisoning better than the ancients. They created these enamels for the face. It wasn't just a light dusting of powder, it was a thick, opaque paste made of white lead and vinegar. You would essentially paint yourself into a mask. Imagine the routine. You'd sit at your vanity, layering on this bloom of youth, or Laird's enamel, smoothing it over your skin until every freckle, every blemish, and every hint of actual human vitality was buried under a smooth, white crust. It looked stunning under the flickering gaslight of a ballroom. It made you look otherworldly. But of course, because lead is what it is, the skin underneath began to react. The lead would slowly eat away at the tissue, causing sores, grayish discoloration, and deep pitting. And what was the Victorian solution to lead-damaged skin? More lead, obviously. You had to fill in the pits. You had to cover the gray with a thicker layer of white. It was a vicious, heavy metal cycle. Some women became so addicted to the look of the enamel that they wouldn't wash it off for days, just patching up the cracks like they were repairing a plaster wall. Eventually, the lead would seep through the skin and enter the bloodstream. This led to wrist drop, where the nerves in your hands would simply give up, leaving your hands dangling uselessly. It led to hair loss, which was great for the wig-making industry, but less great for the women involved. And it led to the vapors, which we now know was likely just the slow, agonizing onset of lead-induced encephalopathy. But in a society that expected women to be fainting and delicate anyway, the symptoms of being slowly poisoned were often mistaken for the symptoms of being a perfect lady. Because why be healthy when you can be a tragic, immobilized work of art? Let's float over to the eyes. The Victorians were obsessed with soulful eyes, large, dark, and dilated, as if you were permanently surprised, or perhaps in the middle of a very deep, very poetic internal monologue. To achieve this, they turned to atropa belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. Because, of course, why use a cucumber slice when you can use a botanical neurotoxin? Fashionable women would drop diluted belladonna juice directly into their eyes. It would paralyze the muscles in the iris, causing the pupils to dilate into huge black pools. It gave them a watery, luminous look that was considered the height of romantic beauty. The downside? Well, aside from the fact that you couldn't actually see anything since your eyes couldn't adjust to light, it caused chronic blurry vision, increased heart rate, and, if used long enough, permanent blindness. There's something incredibly sleepless about the image of a Victorian dinner party, a room full of people sitting in a green-walled box, the women wearing lead masks they can't crack, staring at each other with giant, unblinking, belladonna-dilated eyes that can't actually focus on the food. It wasn't a party, it was a collection of very high-end zombies waiting for the carriage ride home. And the men weren't entirely exempt from the chemical warfare either. While they weren't usually dropping nightshade in their eyes, they were busy slicking their hair back with macassar oil. This oil was so thick and stain-prone that every middle-class home had to invent anti-macassars, those little lace doilies on the backs of chairs, just to keep the furniture from being ruined by the patriarch's head. But for the truly adventurous gentlemen, there were hair restorers and dyes filled with silver nitrate and, you guessed it, more lead. Because if your wife was going to have wrist drop, you might as well have a scalp that glowed in the dark. It was a world where cleanliness was a moral imperative, but the products used to achieve it were filthy with toxins. They had soaps that contained carbolic acid strong enough to peel skin, and tooth powders made of charcoal and pulverized coral that literally ground away the enamel they were trying to save. It was a relentless, polite, and very well-dressed assault on the human body. As the night gets deeper, we have to talk about the strangest trend of all, the romanticization of tuberculosis, or consumption. For a good portion of the 19th century, being deathly ill was actually trendy. Consumption was seen as a poetic disease. It was thought to affect the sensitive, the artistic, and the refined. Unlike the plague or cholera, which were messy and common, consumption was a slow fading away. It made you pale. It made your eyes bright with fever. It made you thin. It was the original heroin chic, but with more lace handkerchiefs and coughing up blood. Women who weren't actually sick would use makeup to mimic the symptoms. They'd use rouge to create a feverish flush on the cheekbones. They'd use blue pencils to draw veins on their skin to make it look thinner and more translucent. They'd even starve themselves to get that waif-like, about to transcend this mortal coil silhouette. Even the Great Exhibition of 1851 featured displays of invalid furniture, beautifully carved, velvet-lined chairs designed specifically for people to languish in. It was a culture that had turned the process of dying into a decorative art form. Of course, the reality of tuberculosis was horrific. It was a slow, suffocating death that decimated families across all social classes. But the Victorians had this incredible ability to take a tragedy and put a corset on it. They didn't want to solve the problem, they wanted to make the problem look like a painting by the pre-Raphaelites. Let's just settle into that thought. A whole society, from the queen down to the chimney sweep, living in a world of beautiful, toxic illusions. They were surrounded by death, in their walls, on their faces, in their very lungs, and they responded by making sure the colors were just the right shade of green, and the lace was perfectly white. It's a quiet, heavy kind of history, a reminder that we see what we want to see, even if what we're looking at is a lead-lined mask staring back from a poison-tinted mirror. So we've covered the walls and the faces, the green gas and the lead-lined smiles, but eventually, the Victorian at home would feel a bit off. Maybe it was the lead, maybe it was the arsenic, or maybe it was just the crushing weight of living in a house where you weren't allowed to show an ankle without causing a scandal. When that inevitable headache or bout of nerves arrived, the Victorians didn't go to a pharmacy in the way we do now. They went to the cabinet of wonders, the world of patent medicines. And this, my friends, is where the Victorian era gets truly, deeply quiet. Because the cure for almost everything back then was essentially just a very polite way of being heavily sedated. Take, for example, the soothing syrups. If you were a Victorian mother and your baby was teething or just being, well, a baby, you might reach for a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The advertisements featured a lovely maternal figure looking down at a peaceful sleeping infant, and the baby was definitely sleeping. Why? Because the syrup contained a generous helping of morphine and ammonia. It was effectively a nursery knockout. They called it the mother's friend, but a more accurate name would have been the pharmacological coma. Of course, the babies would wake up, if they were lucky, feeling incredibly lethargic and suffering from what we now recognize as withdrawal. But to the Victorian eye, a quiet child was a healthy child. If the baby didn't cry, the humors must be balanced. It's a tragic irony, isn't it? A society so obsessed with the moral purity of children that they were unwittingly turning their nurseries into tiny lace-covered opium dens. But it wasn't just the children. The adults were in on it too. If you were a gentleman feeling a bit run down after a long day of empire building, you might take some laudanum. It was just opium dissolved in alcohol. Simple, elegant, lethal. It was used for everything: coughs, diarrhea, melancholy, or just a rainy Tuesday. It was cheaper than gin and twice as effective at making you forget that your wallpaper was trying to kill you. The great writers of the age, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Thomas de Quincey, were all essentially functioning, or not functioning, in a hazy, laudanum-soaked dreamscape. De Quincey even wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which, in a very Victorian twist, became a bestseller. People didn't read it as a warning, they read it as a travel guide for the mind. And then there were the electric cures. As the 1800s progressed, people became obsessed with the new invisible force of electricity. Since nobody really understood how it worked, they assumed it was a magical life force. You could buy electric belts that promised to send a constant, invigorating current through your internal organs. They were marketed to men who were exhausted, an 1800s euphemism for, well, let's just say marital difficulties. Imagine a Victorian man wearing a heavy wool suit, a stiff collar, and a leather belt lined with zinc and copper plates that were supposed to be activated by his own sweat. It didn't provide a spark of life, it mostly just gave him a nasty chemical burn around his midsection. But because it hurt, people assumed it was working. That's a very Victorian mindset. If it's uncomfortable, it must be moral. As we drift toward the end of our journey, we see the Victorian era bleeding into the Edwardian and the toxins becoming even more high-tech. In the very late 1990s, Marie Curie discovered radium, and for a brief, glowing moment, the world lost its mind. Radium was the ultimate version of the arsenic craze. It glowed in the dark, it was energetic, it was pure. People began putting radium in everything. There was radium water to drink for vitality, radium chocolate, and even radium-infused wool for baby blankets, to keep them warm, you see. The Victorian obsession with light and spirit found its perfect, and most deadly, match in radioactivity. They thought they had finally found the innate heat that the old humors theory had talked about. They didn't realize that this particular heat was busy rearranging their DNA. It's a strange, looping cycle of history. We started with a green pigment that poisoned the air, moved to lead that masked the skin, and ended with a glowing element that dissolved the very bones of the people who used it. But tonight, we are safe. The green wallpaper has been replaced with breathable paint, the lead makeup is in museums, the soothing syrups have been swapped for herbal tea. The Victorian era, with all its stiff collars and toxic beauty, is just a story we tell to help us drift off. It was a world that tried so hard to be perfect, to be balanced, and to be beautiful, that it forgot to check if it was actually surviving. It was a 1.5-hour-long experiment in how much the human body can endure for the sake of a good aesthetic. So just let your breath slow down. Imagine the vapors lifting, the heavy velvet curtains opening, and a cool, clean breeze blowing through those old, emerald-painted halls. Everything is clear now. Everything is quiet. The history is over for today. The lights are out. The past is just a shadow on the wall. Sleep well.